The cold seeped through the thin walls of the apartment, a damp chill that promised a long, miserable night. For Liam, the chill was more than just the weather. It was a coldness that had settled deep in his bones, a permanent resident in his soul. His hands, calloused and scarred from 2 decades in construction, rested on the rickety kitchen table. They were strong hands, hands that had built houses, but now they trembled slightly as they traced the edges of the eviction notice. The paper felt brittle, final. Outside, the rain beat a relentless rhythm against the single grimy window, each drop a tiny hammer against his frayed nerves. The air in the room was thick with the scent of dust and unspoken despair. He felt his heart tighten into a dense, heavy knot in his chest. It was a familiar feeling, a physical ache that had been his companion ever since the layoff notice, ever since his wife had walked out, leaving a silence that was louder than any argument. He was 42, and he had never felt so utterly broken, adrift in a hostile world. He pulled the wad of cash from his pocket, the last of his severance pay. He smoothed the bills out on the table, a ritual he'd performed every night for the past week. 12 crisp $100 bills, $1,200. It looked like a lot of money, but Liam knew it was nothing. It was a bandage on a gaping wound, a single sandbag against a rising flood. His stomach twisted, a painful knot of hunger and raw anxiety. He hadn't eaten a real meal in 3 days, saving every scrap for his daughter, Maya. The memory of his wife's face, cold and distant as she said goodbye, flashed in his mind. Another phantom limb in a life of amputations. First the job, then his marriage, now his home. The quiet drip, drip, drip of the leaky faucet in the sink was the only sound, a maddeningly steady metronome counting down the seconds to his complete and utter failure. He felt the cold sweat prickle his hairline. This money wasn't a lifeline, it was an anchor, and he was sinking fast. The pressure building, threatening to crush him. From the corner of his eye, he could see into the small, adjoining room where his daughter slept. Maya, 7 years old. She was a tiny lump under a threadbare blanket, her breathing soft and even, blessedly unaware of the abyss her father was staring into. A wave of love so fierce it was painful washed over Liam, immediately followed by a suffocating tide of guilt. He had failed her. His only job was to protect her, to provide for her, and he was failing. He rose silently, his chair scraping softly against the linoleum, and crept to her bedside. The room was icy, and he could feel the draft from the poorly sealed window frame. He gently pulled the blanket up to her chin, his rough, work-worn fingers brushing against her soft cheek. She stirred, murmuring something in her sleep, and a single, hot tear escaped his eye and traced a cold path down his cheek. He felt hollowed out, a fragile shell of the man he once was. The responsibility for this small, perfect life felt like a physical weight on his shoulders, a mountain he no longer had the strength to climb. Returning to the kitchen, Liam leaned against the counter, the cheap laminate cold against his back. The sounds of the city, usually a comforting hum, now felt like a mockery. A distant siren wailed, a sharp cry in the night, and he imagined a life-or-death emergency, a drama unfolding somewhere else, and felt a strange, bitter envy. At least those people had something happening. His life wasn't a drama. It was a slow, quiet suffocation. He opened the cupboard door with a weary creak. The contents were a testament to his poverty. A single can of tomato soup, a half-empty box of stale crackers, and a jar of peanut butter scraped almost clean. His stomach cramped violently, a painful reminder of his own hunger. He felt a surge of nausea, not just from hunger, but from the sheer, overwhelming panic that was threatening to choke him. The ticking of the cheap plastic clock on the wall grew louder, each tick an accusation, each tock a judgment. He was running out of time. The walls of the small apartment seemed to be closing in, shrinking with every second that passed. He slumped back into the chair at the table, his gaze falling once more on the pink slip of the eviction notice. The words swam before his tired eyes, a jumble of legal threats and unforgiving deadlines. The final date. It was seared into his brain like a brand. Just 3 days away. A tremor started in his hands, a physical manifestation of the exhaustion that had settled into his very marrow. His mind raced, desperately sifting through impossible options, dead ends, and shattered hopes. Friends, they were all struggling themselves. Family, He had none left to speak of. He looked down at his worn work boots, caked with the dust of a job site he could never return to, a relic from a past life where he was a provider, a builder, a man with a purpose. Now that purpose was stripped down to its most primal, terrifying core, survival. The despair was a physical taste in his mouth, metallic and sour. He had to find a roof, any roof, to put over his daughter's head. The thought was not a choice. It was a command from the deepest part of his being. He would obey it, no matter what. He forced his tired eyes open, the glare of his ancient laptop screen a stark white slash in the oppressive darkness of the room. The machine whirred and groaned, its fan struggling to keep up, a sound that mirrored the laboring of his own heart. His fingers, clumsy with cold and fatigue, tapped across the keyboard, the click-clack of the keys unnaturally loud in the dead of night. He scrolled through endless online listings for rentals, each one a new and inventive way to mock his poverty. Credit check required. First and last month's rent plus security deposit, proof of employment mandatory. The words blurred together, a digital wall he couldn't climb. A bitter taste, the taste of failure, filled his mouth. He felt the familiar squeeze in his chest, a tightening vice of pure, unadulterated panic. The city outside was asleep, but for Liam, there was no rest. There was only the frantic, desperate search for a phantom door, any door. That wasn't about to be slammed shut in his face. The glow of the screen illuminated his haggard features, a mask of sheer desperation. The hours bled into one another, marked only by the changing numbers on the clock in the corner of the screen. 2 a.m. became 3 a.m. His shoulders ached, and a dull throb had started behind his eyes. He sipped cold, bitter coffee from a stained mug, the liquid doing nothing to stave off the bone-deep exhaustion. He had lowered his standards with every passing hour. A single room, a shared bathroom, a place in a dangerous neighborhood. Nothing was within his grasp. The $200 on the table seemed to shrink with every rejection, its value dwindling in the face of reality. He felt a profound sense of isolation, as if he were the only person awake in the entire world, fighting a battle he was destined to lose. The silence from Maya's room was a fragile gift, a temporary reprieve from having to see the fear and confusion in her eyes. He had to find something. The thought was a relentless drumbeat in his skull. He couldn't let her wake up to a father who had given up, a father with no plan and no hope left to offer. He was failing, and the weight of it was crushing. Just as he was about to surrender to the exhaustion, to close the laptop and admit defeat, his eyes caught a strange listing. It was buried deep in a classified site, under a miscellaneous section. The text was minimal, almost cryptic. For sale, basement storage and utility unit, cash only, $1,000. There was no photo, just a stark address in an older part of the city. A cold knot formed in Liam's stomach. It sounded wrong. A utility unit wasn't a home, it was a box, it was a scam. Every rational part of his brain screamed at him to close the page, to forget he ever saw it. But another, more primal voice, the voice of a father staring into the abyss of homelessness, whispered a dangerous question. What if it wasn't? What if it was just a space, a roof, 4 walls, a place to keep his daughter safe from the rain and the cold? It was a sliver of hope so thin it was transparent, but in his utter darkness, it shone with the intensity of a searchlight. He felt a tremor in his hands as he reread the ad, $1,000. It would take almost everything he had left. He stared at the listing for a long, agonizing minute, the cursor blinking over the phone number. The drip from the kitchen faucet continued its maddeningly steady rhythm, each drop a tiny countdown to his decision. His mind raced, constructing a fragile fantasy around those few words. Maybe it was large. Maybe it had a toilet and a sink. Maybe the previous owner had fixed it up. Hope, treacherous and seductive, began to bloom in the barren landscape of his mind. He imagined Maya, safe and warm, sleeping soundly, and the image was all the fuel he needed. The risks were colossal. Buying a space site unseen was an act of pure desperation, a gambler's last throw of the dice. But the alternative was the street. It was a homeless shelter, surrounded by the ghosts of other broken lives. He couldn't do that to Maya. He would not do that to her. A sudden, cold resolve washed over him, extinguishing the fear. He took a deep, shuddering breath. He picked up his phone. The decision was made. It was a terrible, reckless choice, but it was the only one he had. The next morning, the grey light of dawn did little to warm the frigid apartment. Liam moved with a grim, mechanical purpose. He woke Maya gently, his voice a strained imitation of cheerfulness, as he told her they were going on an adventure to a new place. Her sleepy, trusting eyes looked up at him, and he felt a sharp pang of guilt that was so intense it was like a physical blow. Her innocence was a sacred trust he was about to betray. Before she was fully awake, he slipped out, his worn boots echoing in the empty hallway of the apartment building. The walk to the ATM was a walk of shame. The machine's electronic chime sounded accusatory as it dispensed his money. 10 $100 bills. He held the cash in his hand, the sum of his entire life's work, now reduced to a desperate, last-ditch gamble. The paper felt flimsy, unreal. With this act, he was severing his last tie to his old life, stepping off a cliff into total uncertainty. He felt a wave of dizziness, but he pushed it down. There was no turning back now. They left with a single, battered suitcase and a backpack filled with Maya's favorite stuffed animals. Liam didn't look back at the apartment building. To look back was to acknowledge what he was losing, and he didn't have the strength for that. He held Maya's small hand tightly, his own palm slick with a cold sweat. They boarded a crosstown bus, the engine groaning as it pulled away from the curb. The bus was filled with the tired, anonymous faces of the city, each person lost in their own world. Liam stared out the window, watching the familiar neighborhoods of his life slide by, replaced by unfamiliar streets and buildings. The journey felt surreal, dreamlike. He felt detached from his own body, an automaton going through the motions. Maya, sensing his tension, was unusually quiet, her face pressed against the cool glass of the window. Her silence was more unnerving than any question could have been. A cold dread began to creep back in, wrapping its icy fingers around his heart. What had he done? The question echoed in the rhythmic thump of the bus's tires on the pavement. The bus ride stretched on, a long, monotonous journey into the heart of his own recklessness. The landscape outside the grimy window shifted from bustling commercial districts to quiet residential streets and then, finally, to an older, more industrial part of the city. The buildings grew taller, grayer, their facades stained with decades of soot and neglect. Liam felt his stomach clench. This was not the kind of neighborhood where you found a hidden gem. This was where hope went to die. He checked the address on the crumpled piece of paper in his pocket for the 10th time, his heart sinking with each passing block. He tried to project an aura of calm for Maya, even pointing out a flock of pigeons, but his voice sounded hollow and strange in his own ears. The air inside the bus grew stale, thick with the smell of diesel fumes and damp wool. He felt trapped, a passenger on a journey to his own ruin, with his precious daughter as his unwilling companion. The bus hissed to a stop. "This is your stop," the driver called out, his voice flat and disinterested. Liam's blood ran cold. They stepped off the bus into a gust of chilly, damp wind that smelled of wet concrete and exhaust. Before them stood the building. It was an old, pre-war monolith of brick and stone, perhaps once grand, but now it loomed over the street with a grim, foreboding presence. The windows on the upper floors were like vacant eyes, staring down at them with cold indifference. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down Liam's spine. This was it, the place where he had staked his entire future. Holding Maya's hand in a death grip, he walked towards the entrance. The heavy oak door groaned in protest as he pushed it open, revealing a lobby shrouded in shadow. The air inside was still and heavy, carrying the thick, cloying scent of dust and decades of decay. A single low-wattage bulb cast a weak yellow-orange glow over faded floral wallpaper and a cracked tile floor. Silence. A deep, profound silence that seemed to absorb all sound. Liam felt a lump form in his throat. This wasn't a home. It felt like a mausoleum. A stooped, elderly man met them in the lobby to collect the cash, his eyes darting around nervously. He didn't introduce himself. He simply counted the bills, his fingers like brittle twigs, and then handed Liam a single, rusty key. "Basement. Down the stairs. End of the hall," the man rasped, his voice a dry whisper. He stuffed the money into his pocket and shuffled away without another word. disappearing into the gloom. The transaction was so cold, so impersonal, it felt deeply sinister. Liam's heart pounded against his ribs. He felt like he had just sold his soul. He looked down at Maya, who was clinging to his leg, her small face pale with fear. "It's okay, sweetie," he whispered, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. "Let's go see our new place." He led her towards a heavy steel door marked stairs. The descent was like a journey into the earth. The air grew colder, damper, with every step down the echoing concrete stairwell. The only light came from bare bulbs spaced far apart, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to writhe on the walls. The hallway at the bottom of the stairs was a long, narrow tunnel. The air was thick with the smell of damp soil, of mildew, of things long forgotten and left to rot. The sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere in the darkness, a slow, torturous rhythm. Liam's hand trembled as he found the lock at the end of the hall. The key scraped, refused to turn, and then finally, with a loud, grating click, the lock gave way. He pushed the door open. He reached inside, his fingers fumbling along the cold concrete wall until they found a switch. He flicked it. A single bare bulb suspended from a frayed wire flickered to life, casting a harsh, sickly yellow light. The reality of the place hit Liam with the force of a physical punch. It was a box, a small windowless concrete box. The floor was stained and damp. The walls were bare concrete, and a web of dripping, rusted pipes snaked across the low ceiling. A cold draft, carrying the scent of decay, slithered from a dark corner. This wasn't a home, it was a tomb. "Daddy, I'm scared," Maya whispered, her voice trembling as she buried her face in his leg. "It's so dark." The sound of her fear shattered the last of Liam's composure. He looked around the desolate space, at the dripping pipes that sounded like a slow, weeping cry, at the oppressive concrete walls that seemed to press in on them. A wave of nausea rose hot and fast in his throat. He had done this. He had taken his last $1,000, the only safety net they had, and he had used it to buy a cage for his daughter. A cold, damp, underground cage. The full weight of his catastrophic mistake crashed down on him. There was no money left. There was no other option. There was nothing. He had driven them to the absolute bottom of the world. He felt his knees weaken, the strength draining out of him, as if a plug had been pulled. He had failed, completely and utterly. He had trapped his daughter in a nightmare of his own making, and he had no idea how to get them out. The bare bulb overhead flickered, and for a moment they were plunged into total darkness. The days that followed were a waking nightmare, a descent into a grey, featureless existence. The single bare bulb became their sun and moon, its harsh glare a constant reminder of their confinement. Liam's despair was a physical entity, a heavy cloak he couldn't shrug off. He felt it in the hollow ache of his stomach and the leaden weight in his limbs. Maya, resilient as children are, tried to make a game of it, but her laughter was thin and brittle, easily swallowed by the oppressive silence of the concrete tomb. The relentless drip, drip, drip from the rusted pipes was the soundtrack to their new life, a maddening water torture that frayed Liam's already shattered nerves. Every time he looked at his daughter's pale face, a fresh wave of self-loathing washed over him. He had promised her an adventure, and he had delivered her to a prison. The air, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay, felt heavy in his lungs, as if he were breathing in their own failure. He had to do something, anything to fight the encroaching madness. He decided to clean. It was a futile gesture, an absurd act in a place so saturated with grime and neglect, but it was an action. It was movement. It was a rebellion against the paralysis of his despair. He found a bucket and some old rags left by a previous owner, and he started scrubbing the stained concrete floor. The cold, grimy water sloshed over his hands, but he barely felt it. His mind was a maelstrom of regret and fear. He worked with a frantic energy, scrubbing at stains that had been there for decades, as if by erasing them he could erase his own monumental mistake. He felt a surge of raw anger, at himself, at his wife for leaving, at the world for its casual cruelty. The physical labor was a small release, a way to channel the storm raging inside him into a single, focused task. He wouldn't let this place break them. He wouldn't let Maya see him surrender. He scrubbed until his knuckles were raw, and his back screamed in protest, the rhythmic scraping sound a desperate prayer in the suffocating quiet. Maya watched him from her makeshift bed, a pile of blankets in the driest corner of the room. She had named the corner the castle, a tiny act of childhood imagination that both warmed and broke Liam's heart. He tried to keep his face a mask of determination, but he could feel her worried eyes on him. She was too young to understand the complexities of their situation, the financial ruin, the eviction, but she understood fear. She could feel it radiating from him, a cold aura that the thin blankets couldn't ward off. She could feel it in the deep, oppressive silence of the basement, a silence that was nothing like the quiet of their old apartment. There were no familiar sounds here, no traffic hum, no neighbor's television, no life. There was only the drip, the echo of his scrubbing, and the heavy, pressing weight of the earth all around them. He saw her shiver, a small tremor that ran through her tiny body, and his own heart clenched in a painful spasm of protective love and profound guilt. To distract her and himself, he moved his cleaning efforts to the walls. "Let's make the castle's walls shiny," he said, his voice echoing strangely. He tried for a cheerful tone, but it came out strained, hollow. He started on the back wall, a large, unbroken expanse of what looked like dirty plasterboard. It was stained with patches of dark mildew, and the air near it was noticeably colder, carrying a stronger scent of damp soil. He scrubbed at a particularly dark patch, the rough rag catching on the textured surface. The work was mindless, repetitive. He let his thoughts drift. A dangerous exercise. He thought of warm summer days at the park, of the smell of sawdust at his old job, of the simple comfort of a real bed in a real room. Each memory was a tiny, sharp knife twisting in his gut. The cold from the wall seemed to seep into his bones, a profound, unnatural chill that went beyond the simple dampness of the basement. He felt a weariness so deep it was in his marrow. "Daddy," Maya's small voice cut through his thoughts. "It's windy." Liam paused, his arm aching. He glanced over at her. She had pulled her blanket up to her nose. "There's no wind down here, sweetie," he said gently. "We're underground." "No, I can feel it," she insisted, her voice muffled by the fabric. "It's cold." He was about to dismiss it, to tell her it was just the dampness. But then he stopped. He stood perfectly still, closing his eyes, focusing his senses, and he felt it. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A slow, steady current of frigid air, moving across his skin. It wasn't just cold, it was a draft in a sealed, windowless concrete box buried beneath a building. A cold spike of adrenaline, the first feeling other than despair he'd had in days, shot through him. His exhaustion vanished, replaced by a sharp, sudden alertness. It was impossible. He felt a shiver run down his spine, but this one was not from the cold. It was from the unnerving, profound wrongness of it. His heart began to beat a little faster, a nervous rhythm against the backdrop of the dripping pipes. He moved slowly towards the back wall, his bare hand outstretched. As he got closer, the draft became stronger, a definite stream of icy air. Where was it coming from? He ran his calloused palm over the cold, damp surface of the plasterboard, his fingers searching for a source. The wall felt uniformly solid and cold. He pressed his face close, the mildewy smell filling his nostrils. His eyes scanned the grimy surface, looking for any hole, any gap, any imperfection that could explain the impossible breeze. Then he saw it. It was almost invisible, a line so fine it could have been a spider's thread caught in the paint. A faint hairline crack, running vertically from the floor to about waist height. It was nothing. A simple stress fracture in an old building. But it was exactly where the draft was strongest. A question, the first real question he'd had in days, bloomed in his mind. Why was a simple crack producing a current of air? Liam's instincts as a construction worker, dormant for weeks, suddenly roared to life. He knew materials. He knew how buildings were put together, and he knew how they fell apart. A hairline crack in plasterboard over a concrete foundation wall shouldn't create a draft. Not like this. He knelt, his knees protesting on the cold floor, and examined the crack more closely. It was clean, precise, too precise. He placed his ear against the wall, his cheek pressed to the cold, grimy surface. He held his breath, listening. Nothing. Just the muffled echo of the drip from the pipes, and the faint, distant rumble of the city far above, but the cold was undeniable. It was radiating from this specific spot, a focused patch of intense chill. He stood up and took a step back, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the wall as a whole. It was just a wall, but a tiny seed of suspicion had been planted, and in the barren soil of his despair, it was already beginning to sprout. Something was wrong here. He balled his hand into a fist and tapped the wall gently, about a foot to the left of the crack. The sound was a dull, solid thud, the sound of plasterboard on concrete, exactly what he expected. He moved his hand a foot to the right and tapped again. Thud. Solid. Unremarkable. He felt a flicker of disappointment. Maybe he was losing his mind. Maybe the desperation was making him see mysteries where there were none. He was about to give up, to turn away and sink back into the grey fog of his reality, but his eyes were drawn back to the crack. He took a breath, a sense of foolishness washing over him, and tapped the wall directly over the faint line. The sound was completely different. It wasn't a thud, it was a thrum, a hollow, resonant echo that vibrated back through his knuckles, a sound that had no business coming from a basement wall. His heart leapt into his throat. It was hollow. The wall was hollow. A jolt of pure, unadulterated adrenaline surged through his veins, electric and sharp, chasing away the cold and the hunger. For the first time since they had arrived, a genuine emotion other than misery lit up his face. It was a wild, desperate curiosity. He knocked again, harder this time, tracing the outline of the hollow section. It was a rectangle, a perfectly defined rectangle, about the size of a door. The sound was undeniable, a clear, booming echo in the small room that made Maya sit up from her nest of blankets, her eyes wide. "What's that noise, Daddy?" she asked, her fear tinged with a child's curiosity. "I don't know, sweetie," Liam breathed, his voice tight with excitement. I think we found something." He felt a frantic energy bubbling up inside him, a powerful countercurrent to the tide of hopelessness that had threatened to drown him. A hollow wall, a secret space. It was the stuff of stories, of fantasy. It couldn't be real, but the proof was there, vibrating in the bones of his hand. It was a loop, a question demanding an answer. What was behind this wall, and why was it hidden? He scrambled over to the battered suitcase that held all their worldly possessions. At the bottom, wrapped in an old t-shirt, was his toolbox. The weight of it in his hands was a comfort, a tangible link to the man he used to be, a man who built things, who solved problems. The metallic scent of the tools, a mix of oil and steel, filled his nostrils, a welcome change from the basement's smell of decay. He pulled out a claw hammer and a small pry bar, the worn handles fitting into his palms like old friends. He returned to the wall, his mind racing with possibilities. Was it a crawl space, an old utility access, or something else? The mystery of it was a powerful drug, more potent than any food or rest. For a moment, he forgot his hunger, his poverty, his crushing failure. He was a builder again, faced with a puzzle of wood and plaster and secrets. He felt a grim smile touch his lips. He had spent his life putting walls up. Now he was about to tear one down. "Stand back, Maya," he commanded, his voice firm and purposeful. He positioned the tip of the pry bar at the edge of the hairline crack and tapped it gently with the hammer. A small chip of plaster fell to the floor. He tapped it again, harder this time. The sound of metal on plaster was loud, sharp, and violent in the confined space. Crack. A larger piece of the plasterboard broke away, revealing not the rough grey of concrete, but a glimpse of dark, painted wood. His breath caught in his throat. It was a door. It was a goddamned door. He worked faster now, a feverish energy taking over. He jammed the pry bar into the crack and pulled, the muscles in his back and arms straining. Plaster dust filled the air, a white cloud that swirled in the harsh light of the bare bulb, making him cough. He ignored it, tearing away larger and larger chunks of the wall, revealing more of the dark wood beneath. The hollow space was indeed a perfectly concealed doorway, painted over and plastered to become invisible. He felt a tremor in his hands, a mix of exertion and sheer, heart-pounding excitement. Who would go to such lengths to hide a door? The question hammered in his brain along with the blows of his hammer. He cleared the last of the plasterboard away, revealing the full extent of it, an old, solid wood door. Its surface painted a dingy grey to match the fake wall. It had no handle, only a smallish keyhole, its brass faceplate tarnished black with age. He pushed against it. It didn't budge. Locked. Of course, it was locked. He felt a surge of frustration, followed immediately by grim resolve. He had come this far. He wasn't going to be stopped by a rusty lock. He examined the frame, his builder's eye looking for the weakest point. The hinges were old and recessed, impossible to get at. The lock itself was the only way through. A new, more urgent question formed. What was inside that was so valuable, so important, that it needed to be hidden behind a fake wall and a locked door? He wedged the tip of his pry bar into the thin gap between the door and the frame, right next to the lock. He put his shoulder into it, grunting with the effort. The old wood groaned in protest, a long, deep sound like a dying animal. The metal of the pry bar bit into the frame, but the lock held firm. "Come on," he hissed through gritted teeth, sweat beading on his forehead and trickling into his eyes. He repositioned the bar, trying to get more leverage. The smell of splintering wood filled the air, sharp and resinous. He gave another mighty heave, putting every ounce of his strength, every bit of his frustration and anger and desperation into the effort. The doorframe cracked. Splinters flew. The sound was deafening. He pulled again, and with a final explosive snap, the lock mechanism shattered, and the door flew inward, swinging open into a gulf of absolute, undisturbed darkness. A gust of air, impossibly old and stale, washed over him, carrying the scent of dust, dry paper, and time itself. Liam stood frozen for a moment, his chest heaving, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The darkness behind the door was complete, a solid blackness that seemed to absorb the light from their small room. It was the darkness of a place that hadn't seen a single ray of light in decades. He felt a primal fear, a hesitation to step across the threshold into that unknown space. It felt like breaking a taboo, like disturbing a grave. Maya crept up behind him, her small hand clutching the back of his jeans. "What is it, Daddy?" she whispered, her voice filled with awe and a little fear. He didn't answer. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers slick with sweat, and switched on its flashlight. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the stale air from the hidden room filling his lungs, and aimed the bright, white beam of light through the doorway. The silence was profound, as if they had just breached a tomb sealed for generations. The beam of light cut a clean, sharp path through the thick, swirling dust motes, illuminating a scene that stole Liam's breath away. It was a room, a small hidden study, perfectly preserved as if it had been frozen in time. Against the far wall stood a heavy, dark wood desk, its surface coated in a thick, uniform layer of grey dust. A leather-backed chair was pushed neatly beneath it, as if its owner had just stood up and walked away. Bookshelves lined one wall, packed with old leather-bound volumes whose titles were obscured by the same shroud of dust. The air was so still, so utterly devoid of any current, that the dust lay like a soft grey blanket over everything. It was a time capsule, a secret world that had existed just inches from them, silent and unknown, for who knew how long. A sense of profound wonder washed over Liam, eclipsing his fear. He felt like an archaeologist who had just stumbled upon a forgotten chamber in a pyramid. He took a hesitant step into the room, his boots making no sound on the dust-covered floor. Maya followed, her initial fear replaced by wide-eyed fascination. The beam of his flashlight played across the room, revealing more details. An old-fashioned fountain pen lay next to a glass inkwell on the desk. A pipe rested in a ceramic ashtray. It was a snapshot of a life abruptly ended. He ran his finger across the back of the leather chair, leaving a clean, dark streak in the thick dust. He felt a strange connection to the person who had last sat here, a ghost whose presence still lingered in the silent air. Who was this person, and why did they need to build this secret sanctuary? The questions multiplied, each one more compelling than the last. His gaze swept the room, searching for an answer, for anything that might explain the profound mystery of this place. Then his light fell on something tucked away in the deep knee-hole beneath the desk. It was a safe, not a small, modern lockbox, but an old, heavy-duty steel safe, painted black with a large, formidable-looking combination dial on its face. His heart gave a powerful thump. This was it. This had to be the reason for the hidden door, for all the secrecy. Whatever was inside this safe was the heart of the mystery. He knelt, the flashlight beam trembling slightly in his hand. The safe was squat and solid, probably weighing several £100. The combination dial was frozen with age and rust. There was no hope of guessing the code or manipulating the lock. A fresh wave of adrenaline hit him. He was a construction worker. He didn't need a combination, he had a pry bar. The thought was reckless, destructive, but the pull of the secret inside was too strong to resist. He had to know. The safe was a promise, a potential answer to prayers he hadn't even dared to whisper. He went back for his tools, his movements quick and decisive. The heavy hammer and the long pry bar felt like extensions of his own will. He wedged the pointed end of the pry bar into the thin seam around the safe's heavy door and began to hammer it in. The sound of steel striking steel was shockingly loud, a series of deafening clangs that echoed off the concrete walls of the outer room. It was brutal, strenuous work. He slammed the hammer again and again, driving the wedge deeper, sweat pouring down his face, his muscles screaming in protest. It was a battle of wills against the dead man's secret. He grunted, he swore, he put every ounce of his desperate energy into the task, fueled by a frantic hope that was so intense it was painful. The metal of the safe door began to groan, to bend under the relentless pressure. He gave one final, desperate heave on the pry bar, and with a screech of tortured metal, the locking bolts gave way. With his heart pounding in his ears, he pulled the heavy steel door open. It swung outwards with a low groan, its rusty hinges complaining at being disturbed after so many years of silence. He aimed his flashlight into the dark interior, his hand shaking so badly the beam of light danced and trembled. For a second he felt a pang of disappointment. There were no stacks of cash, no glittering jewels, no bars of gold. The safe was filled with paper, stacks and stacks of it, all bound neatly with string. But as he looked closer, he saw that it wasn't just paper. On top of one stack was a thick, leather-bound book with a worn cover, a diary. He reached in, his fingers brushing against the cool, dry paper, and lifted one of the stacks out. They weren't just documents. They were official, engraved certificates. He could make out the words Deutsche Bank and the date, 1945. They were bearer bonds, stacks of them, potentially worth a fortune. He felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. He carefully placed the stack of bonds on the dusty desk and reached back into the safe. He pulled out the leather-bound book. The cover was soft and worn from use. The leather cracked with age. He opened it gently, a puff of dry, papery dust rising from the pages. The book was filled with dense, elegant handwriting, line after line of script that flowed across the page. But he couldn't read a single word. It was all in German. He flipped through the pages, seeing dates, names, and numbers, a story written in a language he didn't understand. His gaze fell back to the bonds. He didn't know what they were worth, or if they were even still valid, but the sheer volume of them was staggering. This wasn't just money. The German diary, the bonds dated 1945, a story was beginning to take shape in his mind, a story of war, and flight, and secrets. He felt the immense weight of his discovery settle on him. He hadn't just found money, he had stumbled into history. He sat back on his heels, the flashlight beam illuminating the incredible scene before him. The open safe, the stacks of forgotten wealth, the silent, indecipherable diary. The dripping pipes in the outer room seemed a world away. His own problems, his hunger and desperation, momentarily faded into the background, dwarfed by the magnitude of what he held in his hands. This room wasn't just a hiding place, it was a vault of secrets. The diary was the key, the bonds were the treasure, but the story was the real discovery. He felt a profound sense of responsibility settle over him. This wasn't his. It belonged to the ghost who had built this room, to the people whose names were likely written in the pages of that diary. He felt a shiver trace its way down his spine, a mix of awe and a new, more complex kind of fear. He had been looking for a roof over his head, a simple escape from poverty. Instead, he had unearthed a 70-year-old secret, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his life had just changed forever. He looked over at Maya, who was peering into the safe with wide, curious eyes. To her, it was just old paper. She had no concept of the history, the value, or the danger that these documents might represent. He felt a sudden, fierce urge to protect her, not just from the cold and hunger, but from the story he had just unearthed. but there was no putting it back. The door was broken, the safe was open, the secret was out. He gently closed the diary and held it in his hands. The leather felt cool and smooth against his skin. It was a tangible piece of a forgotten life. He had 1,000 questions and no answers. Who was the banker? Whose assets were these? And why did he die before he could reclaim them? A new loop had opened, a vast and complex mystery that stretched back decades. He had found a potential fortune, but he had a terrifying feeling that he had also found a world of trouble. The air in the secret room felt heavy, charged with the weight of the past. He gathered the bonds and the diary, his movements careful and deliberate. He couldn't leave them here. This secret was his now, his responsibility. He felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. For the first time in a long time, he had a purpose beyond simple survival. He had to understand this story. He had to figure out what these documents meant. He carried them out of the dusty study, back into the harsh glare of the single bulb in their concrete cell. The room, which had seemed like the ultimate symbol of his failure, now looked different. It was no longer just a tomb. It was a treasure chamber, a place of secrets. He placed the bonds and the diary carefully in his toolbox, a new kind of treasure among his old tools. The weight of the box felt different now, heavier. It contained not just his past, but a stranger's past, and a future that was suddenly terrifyingly unknown. The dripping of the pipes continued its steady rhythm, but now it sounded less like a countdown to doom and more like the ticking of a clock on a story, waiting to be told. The despair that had been his constant companion was gone, replaced by a nervous, vibrating energy. He looked at the shattered doorframe of the secret room and then at the toolbox. He had broken into a dead man's life, and now he held the pieces in his hands. A new kind of fear began to creep in, a cold and rational fear that was far more potent than the blind panic of poverty. What if someone knew about this room? What if someone else was looking for it? The secrecy, the hidden door, the heavy safe, it all screamed of danger. This wasn't a forgotten inheritance, it was hidden for a reason, and he had just announced his presence with a hammer and a pry bar. He felt a chill run through him that had nothing to do with the basement's damp air. He had wanted a solution to his problems, a simple lifeline. What he had found was a complex, dangerous secret, and he and his daughter were now standing squarely in the middle of it. The mystery was exhilarating, but the potential consequences were terrifying. Back in the oppressive confines of the concrete cell, Liam hunched over the leather-bound diary. His phone's camera pointed at the elegant, spidery script. The translation app, a marvel of technology he barely understood, felt like a profane intrusion into this sacred space. Its robotic female voice was a stark, sterile contrast to the 70-year-old secrets whispering from the page. A low hum emanated from the phone, the only sound besides the ceaseless, maddening drip from the pipes. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, a dry, academic smell that was at odds with the raw, emotional story beginning to unfold. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of anticipation and dread. He held his breath as the first block of German text rendered into English on the screen. The words appeared, cold and clinical. October 1945. I have found the location. The foundation is deep. No one will think to look beneath the ground floor. The work must begin at night, alone. The starkness of it sent a cold shiver down Liam's spine. The app's voice continued its dispassionate narration, turning a man's desperate flight into a sterile report. Liam learned his name was Jacob Rosenthal. He was a banker from Berlin. The diary entries, when translated, painted a terrifying picture of a world descending into madness. Liam felt the cold of the concrete floor seep into his bones as he read about the yellow stars, the smashed windows of Kristallnacht, the neighbors who suddenly looked away. The robotic voice spoke a line that made the hair on Liam's arm stand up. They burn our books and our laws in the public square. It is only a matter of time before they start burning us. A profound sense of horror gripped Liam. This wasn't a story from a history book. It was a first-hand account of terror, written by the man who had built this secret room. The stale air suddenly felt heavy, filled with the ghost of Jakob's fear. He felt a nauseating lurch in his stomach, a sense of falling into a past that was suddenly, terrifyingly alive and present. Then came the truth about the bonds. As the app translated page after page, a devastating realization dawned on Liam. The assets were not Jacob's. The diary was a meticulous ledger of faith. He had been entrusted with the life savings of dozens of Jewish families, his friends, his clients, his community, who saw the coming storm and desperately sought to save what they could. The robotic voice read the names like a ghostly roll call: the Rosenbaums, their textile factory assets; the Adlers, their daughter's dowry; the Klein family, everything they had. Liam felt the hope of a personal windfall curdle into a heavy, crushing weight in his chest. This wasn't a treasure to be spent. It was a sacred trust. It was the last remnant of lives that had almost certainly been extinguished in the fires of the Holocaust. He looked at the stacks of bonds, no longer seeing money but seeing the faces of families, the hopes of parents, the futures of children, all distilled into these fragile pieces of paper. The diary detailed Jacob's harrowing escape from Germany and his journey to America. He described purchasing the building under an assumed name and spending months in secret by candlelight, constructing the hidden study and reinforcing the safe. His plan was simple and noble: to wait until the war was over, then dedicate his life to finding the heirs of the families who had trusted him. But the diary's tone shifted abruptly. The entries became shorter, the handwriting less steady. He wrote of a sudden, racking cough, of a fever that burned behind his eyes. The final entry, dated December 1945, was just a few words, a weak, barely legible scrawl that the app struggled to decipher. "I am so cold. The work is not finished." And then, nothing. The pages after it were blank. The story just stopped. Jacob had died here alone, feet away from the fortune he was trying to protect, his promise unfulfilled. A profound and unexpected grief washed over Liam for the long-dead banker. He sat back, the phone slipping from his numb fingers. The silence in the basement felt different now, heavier, filled with the immense weight of Jacob's unfinished duty. He, Liam, a broke, desperate construction worker, was now the sole inheritor of this 70-year-old promise. The thought was so overwhelming it made him feel dizzy. The dripping pipes, the cold concrete, his own gnawing hunger, it all seemed trivial in the face of this historical tragedy. He glanced over at Maya, who had fallen asleep in her makeshift castle of blankets, her small chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm, utterly oblivious. A fierce, protective instinct flared in his chest. He had stumbled into something far bigger and more dangerous than poverty. This wasn't just a secret. It was a burden. A sharp, sudden knock on the main door of their basement unit echoed through the space, loud and violent. The sound was so unexpected, so alien in their isolated world, that Liam's heart stopped dead in his chest. His blood ran cold. Every muscle in his body went rigid. Who could possibly be knocking on their door? No one knew they were here. No one except the shadowy man who took his cash. A cold dread, sharp and acidic, rose in his throat. He scrambled silently, his stockinged feet making no sound on the concrete. He shoved the diary and the bonds deep into his toolbox and slid it under the pile of blankets next to Maya. He crept to the door, his heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against his ribs. He felt utterly exposed, a cornered animal. He put his eye to a tiny crack in the doorframe, peering into the dim yellow light of the outer hallway. His breath caught in his throat. It was a man, but not the stooped, nervous figure from before. This man stood ramrod straight, a silhouette of quiet authority in the gloom, his posture radiating a chilling patience. He knocked again, 3 sharp, precise raps that sounded like judgment. With a trembling hand, Liam unlatched the door and opened it a few inches. The man standing in the hallway was a complete anachronism in this place of decay. He was elderly, perhaps in his late 70s, but he wore an impeccably tailored dark grey suit that must have cost more than Liam had made in 6 months. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the weak light from the bare bulbs. A subtle, clean scent of expensive cologne and cedar drifted into the room, though stark and offensive contrast to the pervasive smell of mildew and damp earth. The man's face was a network of fine wrinkles, but his eyes, a pale and startling blue, were sharp, intelligent, and utterly devoid of warmth. A thin, polite smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach those cold, calculating eyes. "Good evening," the man said, his voice smooth and cultured, every syllable perfectly articulated. Liam felt a wave of pure, primal fear. This was not a friendly visitor. "I am Alistair Finch," the man continued, his smile unwavering. "I am the president of the building's co-op board. I hope I'm not disturbing you." The politeness was a weapon designed to disarm and intimidate. Liam could only stammer, "No. We were just—" He couldn't finish the sentence. What were they just doing? Hiding, existing, unearthing secrets that could get them killed. The power imbalance was staggering and immediate. Finch's gaze swept past Liam, taking in the squalor of the concrete box, the pile of blankets, the single bare bulb. His eyes registered everything, his expression unchanging, a mask of polite appraisal that felt more condemning than any sneer. Liam felt a hot flush of shame, followed by a cold spike of terror. Finch's eyes seemed to see everything, right down to the frantic pounding of Liam's heart. He felt like an insect under a microscope, pinned and helpless. The man radiated a kind of ancient predatory power. "I must confess," Finch said, his gaze lingering for a moment on the back wall where the plaster was freshly broken. "I was quite surprised when I saw on our security system that this unit had been occupied. It's been vacant for a very long time." The casual mention of cameras sent a jolt through Liam. He was being watched. Every move he made, every moment they were down here, had been observed. The offer came next, smooth as silk. "This is no place for anyone to live. As a gesture of goodwill, the board would be willing to buy the unit back from you. Let's say for $1,500. A modest profit for your trouble." The offer hung in the air, a poisoned lifeline. $1,500. It was a fortune. It was a bus ticket to anywhere else. It was food, a deposit on a real apartment, a way out. Liam's mind reeled. It was the easy answer, the safe answer. He just had to say yes, and this nightmare could be over. But he couldn't speak. The weight of Jakob Rosenthal's diary felt like a physical presence in the room. He thought of the names, the Rosenbaums, the Adlers, the Kleins. Taking Finch's money would mean turning his back on them, leaving their legacy to rot, or worse, to be claimed by this cold, predatory man. That war raged within him, the primal need to protect his daughter, to grab the lifeline and run, fought against the newfound, terrifying sense of duty. His silence stretched, thick and heavy in the damp air. He felt his palms grow slick with sweat. He could feel Finch's pale blue eyes on him, waiting, probing. The man knew something. This wasn't a random act of charity, it was a test. It was a move in a game Liam didn't even know he was playing. A game whose rules were written long before he was born. The dripping of the pipes seemed to mock him, each drop a reminder of the time he was wasting. He had to say something, but the words wouldn't come. Finch's polite smile tightened, the skin around his eyes crinkling. "It is a very generous offer, mister." He let the question hang, forcing Liam to identify himself, to become a person rather than a shadow. "Liam," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. Finch nodded slowly. "Liam. You see, Liam, I worry about the liabilities. This is a very old building." His gaze drifted pointedly towards the corner where Maya was sleeping. A small, vulnerable lump under the thin blankets. "It's not zoned for residential use, and of course, a terrible legal situation for all involved, should the city find out. And the infrastructure. It's so very fragile." The meaning was unmistakable. The polite veneer was cracking, revealing the steel threat beneath. He was not just offering a deal, he was laying out the consequences for refusing it. The air grew thick with menace, so palpable Liam could almost taste it, metallic and sour on his tongue. The man took a half-step closer, invading Liam's personal space. His voice dropped to a low, confidential tone that was far more terrifying than a shout. "Accidents happen," Finch whispered, the words slithering into the small room like a snake. Terrible, tragic accidents. Old wiring, a spark in the night, rusted plumbing, a sudden flood. He painted a vivid, horrifying picture of disaster, his calm, cultured voice making it all the more chilling. He was not speculating, he was promising. This is what he could do, this is what he would do. Liam felt a surge of nausea, a hot, choking bile rising in his throat. He instinctively moved to block Finch's view of Maya, his body tensing. The primal, protective rage of a father was a roaring fire in his chest, but his fear was a tidal wave, threatening to extinguish it completely. Finch was a monster wearing a human suit, and he had just threatened his child. As if to prove he held all the cards, Finch's eyes flickered once more to the damaged back wall. He gave a small, knowing chuckle, a dry, rasping sound. "My grandfather was the superintendent here, back in the 40s, he said casually, his gaze locking with Liam's. "He always used to tell stories about this building, stories of the war, of people hiding things. He was convinced there were secrets hidden in the walls of this very basement." The words hit Liam with the force of a physical blow. He knows. He doesn't just suspect, he knows. His grandfather was the superintendent. He was here when Jakob died. A horrifying chain of connections began to form in Liam's mind. The sudden illness, the unfinished work, the superintendent who knew there was a secret. Finch wasn't just continuing a search. He was trying to finish a crime his grandfather had started 70 years ago. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in. Finch seemed to sense he had made his point. He took a step back, the polite mask of the co-op president sliding perfectly back into place. He reached into his suit jacket and produced a crisp, elegant business card, holding it out between two fingers. "Think about my offer, Liam," he said, his voice once again smooth and reasonable. "I'm a very patient man, but this situation, it requires a speedy resolution for everyone's safety, especially the child's." He placed the card on a small, dusty ledge near the door, his movements precise and deliberate. Without another word, he turned and walked away. The sound of his expensive leather shoes clicking on the concrete floor receded down the long, dark hallway, each step a final echoing threat. Liam stood frozen, shaking, the air still thick with the cloying scent of Finch's cologne. He was trapped, utterly and completely trapped. He stared at the small white business card, Alistair Finch's name embossed in elegant script. It felt less like an offer and more like an ultimatum. He looked from the card to the pile of blankets where his daughter slept, so small and fragile. Then his gaze went to the toolbox, where a 70-year-old promise and a fortune in blood money lay hidden. The choice before him was stark and impossible. He could take Finch's money, a guaranteed path to safety for him and Maya, and walk away from this dark history forever. Or he could defy this powerful, ruthless man, becoming the guardian of Jacob's trust and the rightful inheritance of families he would never know. One path led to immediate survival, the other led to mortal danger, a confrontation with a monster who had just threatened to burn them in their sleep. What would you do in Liam's place? Would you take the money and run, ensuring your child's immediate safety? Or would you risk everything to protect a 70-year-old promise and fight for a justice you may never live to see? Liam stood motionless in the center of the concrete box, his breath held tight in his lungs. The echo of Finch's polished shoes faded down the hallway, but his presence lingered like a toxic fog, the cloying scent of his cologne, a ghostly reminder of the threat. The air, which had been merely damp and cold, now felt charged with a predatory malice. Liam's heart, which had been hammering against his ribs, now beat with a slow, heavy dread, each thump a sickening confirmation of his new reality. He was no longer just a man fighting poverty, he was prey. The casual, whispered threat, "accidents happen," played over and over in his mind, a venomous serpent coiling around his thoughts. He felt a profound, chilling isolation, a sense that the very walls of this basement were now aligned against him, allies in Finch's cruel game. The silence was absolute, broken only by the steady drip, drip of the pipe, a sound that now seemed to be counting down the seconds he had left to live. He felt a tremor in his hands and fought to control it. He glanced at the small, white business card Finch had left on the dusty ledge. It seemed to glow in the dim light, a pristine and malevolent object in the surrounding squalor. Alistair Finch, President. The title was a mockery, a thin veil for the monster beneath. Liam felt a sudden, violent urge to snatch the card, to tear it into 1,000 tiny pieces and grind it into the dirt, but he couldn't move. He was paralyzed by a fear so pure and cold, it felt like ice water flooding his veins. The mention of the security cameras had been a masterstroke, transforming his wretched sanctuary into a panopticon. He felt naked, exposed. Every desperate action he had taken laid bare for Finch's cold, analytical gaze. The discovery of the secret room, the breaking of the safe. Finch had likely seen it all. The offer of $1,500 wasn't an act of charity or even a simple buyout. It was a calculated move to see if Liam knew what he had found. His silence had been the answer. Now, The game had changed. Now it was no longer about a deal, it was about elimination. His gaze snapped to the corner where Maya slept, a small, innocent form wrapped in blankets. The full horror of Finch's threat crashed down on him with the force of a physical blow. The promise of fire, of flood. It wasn't for him, it was for her. A wave of protective fury so intense it made him feel sick surged through him, momentarily eclipsing the fear. He was a father. His one sacred duty was to protect this child, and a man in a tailored suit had just threatened her life as casually as one might discuss the weather. The basement, his desperate gamble for a roof over their heads, had become the deadliest trap imaginable. He felt a suffocating sense of guilt. He had led his daughter into the lion's den. Every decision he had made since the eviction notice had been wrong, a step on a path that led directly to this moment, trapped underground with a monster circling above. He felt a tear of pure rage and terror trace a hot path down his cheek. He had to get her out. Not tomorrow. Not in an hour. Now. But how? The impossible choice tore him in two. He could run back to Finch, accept the blood money, and leave Jacob Rosenthal's legacy to be stolen by the grandson of his potential murderer. It was the coward's way out, a betrayal of the dead, but it was a path that led to Maya's safety. Or he could stand his ground, a broke and powerless man against a wealthy, ruthless villain who controlled the very building they were in. It was an act of suicide. The weight of the diary, hidden in the toolbox just feet away, felt like a slab of granite on his chest. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a testament, a duty passed down through time, and it had landed squarely on his shoulders. He felt an agonizing conflict between his primal duty as a father and this new, terrifying duty as a guardian of history. What right did he have to risk his daughter's life for the ghosts of a long-dead family? But what kind of man would he be if he let this evil go unchallenged, if he let Finch win? He had no good options, only a choice between two different kinds of damnation. The claustrophobia of the small room became unbearable. The concrete walls seemed to be shrinking, the air growing thin and unbreathable. He had to move. He had to get out of this box, if only for a moment, to breathe air that wasn't saturated with the smell of decay and the ghost of Finch's cologne. Silently, he slipped out of the basement room, closing the door gently behind him so as not to wake Maya. He stood in the long, dimly lit basement hallway, the cold seeping through the thin soles of his socks. He didn't know where he was going. He just needed to walk, to feel a sense of movement, to fight the paralysis that was creeping into his soul. He took a few steps down the corridor, his shadow long and distorted on the stained walls. It was then that he heard a faint sound, a soft, dry creak. From the other end of the hall, a door had opened a few inches, spilling a thin sliver of warm, yellow light onto the grimy floor. He froze, his every muscle tensing for a fight. A woman's head emerged from the sliver of light. She was ancient, her face a road map of wrinkles, her white hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a simple, faded housecoat, and her body was stooped with age, but her eyes, deep-set and dark, were sharp and missed nothing. They fixed on him instantly, not with the cold calculation of Finch, but with a weary, knowing intelligence. She looked at his pale, terrified face, at his trembling hands, and a flicker of something, pity perhaps, or recognition, crossed her features. She opened the door wider, revealing a small, hunched frame. The warm air that flowed out of her apartment carried the scent of something savory and familiar, like cabbage soup and brewing tea, a stark and comforting contrast to the basement's miasma of rot and fear. Liam stood rooted to the spot, his heart pounding, unsure if this was a new threat or something else entirely. He was a cornered animal, and every new development felt like another side of the trap closing in on him. She said nothing for a long moment, simply observing him with those ancient, penetrating eyes. She seemed to take in his entire story in a single glance, the fear, the desperation, the sleepless nights. Then she spoke, her voice a low, raspy whisper, thick with an accent he couldn't immediately place. It was Slavic, perhaps. Russian. "You have seen the devil, da?" The question was so direct, so unexpected, that it completely disarmed him. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, spoken by someone who knew what the devil looked like. Liam could only nod, a jerky, involuntary movement. He felt his carefully constructed dam of composure begin to crack. The woman's gaze softened slightly. He has the eyes of a shark, cold and dead. He preys on the weak who live in his building. She pushed her door open fully in a silent invitation. Come, you look like you have seen a ghost. The cold of this place will get in your bones. Come. He hesitated for only a second. There was no menace in her, only a profound, world-weary sadness. He followed her into the light. The apartment was small, barely larger than his concrete cell, but it was a different universe. It was packed to the ceiling with a lifetime of memories, cluttered but immaculately clean. The air was warm and thick with the comforting smells of food and old books. Worn oriental rugs covered the floor, and every surface was draped in embroidered fabrics. Old, sepia-toned photographs in mismatched frames crowded the walls, staring out with the solemn faces of a forgotten generation. It was a sanctuary, a bastion against the decay and malevolence of the rest of the building. The woman gestured to a small, rickety wooden chair at a table covered in an oilcloth. "Sit," she commanded softly, shuffling over to a small stove where a kettle was beginning to whistle. Liam sank into the chair, the simple act of sitting in a warm, lived-in room feeling like an impossible luxury. He felt the tension in his shoulders ease by a fraction. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt a flicker of something other than raw, abject terror. Her name was Elena Petrova. She had lived in this building for over 60 years, she explained as she placed a cup of strong black tea in front of him. The cup was chipped, but it was warm in his freezing hands. The steam rose to his face, a small, fragrant comfort. "I have seen many people come and go," she said, her voice a low murmur, "and I have seen what Finch does. He buys their fear. When they are at their weakest, he comes with his polite words and his money, and he takes everything from them." She looked at him, her dark eyes demanding the truth. "What did he want from you? Why does he want that tomb in the cellar?" Liam looked into her ancient, wrinkled face, and the story came pouring out of him. He told her everything. The desperation, the discovery of the hidden room, the diary, the bonds. He kept his voice to a whisper, the words tumbling out in a torrent of fear and confusion. He felt a profound sense of relief in the telling, in sharing the unbearable weight of the secret with another living soul. He was so lost, so utterly terrified. He took a shaky breath, his voice cracking with emotion. The diary. It belonged to a man named Jacob Rosenthal. At the mention of the name, Eleanor went completely still. The cup in her hand trembled, rattling softly against its saucer. She set it down carefully on the table, her movements slow and deliberate. A shadow passed over her face, a deep and ancient grief that seemed to pull at her features, aging her another 20 years in an instant. She made the sign of the cross over her chest, a gesture that was both automatic and filled with profound meaning. "Jakob," she whispered, the name a ghost on her lips. "I have not heard that name spoken aloud since I was a girl." A heavy silence descended on the small kitchen, thick with the ghosts of the past. Liam felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He had not just stumbled upon a stranger, he had found someone who was part of the story. The loop was closing, the past and present colliding in this tiny, cluttered room. "He was a good man," Elena continued, her voice barely audible. "A kind man. My father, my family. We were from Poland. We saw what was coming. We sold everything we had, our home, our business, and we gave the money to Mr. Rosenthal. He was our only hope." Her eyes stared at a point in the distant past, seeing things Liam could only imagine. "He promised to keep it safe for us here, in America. He gave my father a receipt, a small piece of paper with a number on it. He told him to guard it with his life." She reached into the collar of her dress and pulled out a thin, tarnished chain. Hanging from it was a small, folded piece of paper, yellowed and encased in protective plastic. "My parents. They did not make it out of Warsaw. I was the only one who survived. This is all I have left of them. This and the story." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. They were old tears, shed many times before. The weight of her story, added to Jakob's, was almost too much for Liam to bear. "And Finch?" Liam asked, his voice a strained whisper. "What about his grandfather?" Eleanor's face hardened, the sadness replaced by a cold, brittle anger. "His grandfather was the superintendent, a cruel man with a black heart, a sympathizer. He hated us, all the refugees who came here after the war. He watched Jakob. He saw him working at night, saw the materials he brought in. He knew the banker was hiding something. Her voice dropped lower, filled with a grim certainty. Jakob was not an old man. He was strong, but he got sick, very suddenly. A fever that no doctor could explain. He was dead in a week. She leaned forward, her dark eyes burning into Liam's. Everyone suspected. No one could prove anything. But we all knew. The superintendent poisoned him, hoping Jakob would tell him where the money was hidden before he died. But Jakob was a strong man. He died with his secret. The superintendent spent the rest of his miserable life searching this basement, tapping on walls, tearing up floors. He never found it. The final horrifying piece of the puzzle slammed into place. It wasn't just a suspicion. Finch wasn't just continuing a search. He was the heir to a murderous legacy. His grandfather had murdered Jacob Rosenthal for the bonds, and now Finch was trying to finish the job, to claim the blood money that his family had coveted for 70 years. A wave of nausea rolled through Liam. He felt like he was drowning in the sheer evil of it. Finch is the same as his grandfather, Elena hissed, her voice trembling with decades of repressed fury. He has the same greed, the same coldness in his heart. He has been waiting. And now you have found it for him. You and your child are in mortal danger, you understand me? He will not let you leave this building with that secret. The air crackled with tension. The stakes were no longer abstract. They were immediate and deadly. Finch wouldn't just threaten, he would act. He would kill. Liam's blood ran cold. He had to get Maya and run, disappear into the night, as if summoned by their words. The single light bulb hanging over the kitchen table flickered violently. It buzzed, glowed with a sudden, intense brightness, and then went out. The entire apartment was plunged into an unnerving, profound darkness, the only light coming from the faint, cold glow of the city filtering through the grimy window. A deep, mechanical groan echoed up from the guts of the building, and then silence. A total, dead silence. The hum of the refrigerator, the buzz of the lights, the sounds of the building itself, all gone. Finch had cut the power. A cold knot of pure terror formed in Liam's stomach. It was happening. It was happening now. He knows, Elena whispered in the blackness, her voice grim and devoid of surprise. He is done with the games. He is coming for it now. Liam felt a surge of panic so overwhelming it threatened to paralyze him. Maya, she was alone, in the dark, in that concrete tomb. Just then, a shrill, piercing sound cut through the darkness. It was Liam's phone, ringing in his pocket. The screen lit up, a blinding white rectangle in the oppressive gloom. The caller ID was Elena's number. He looked across the dark table at her shadowy form, confused. "Landline," she explained, her voice urgent. "It has its own power. He cannot cut it," Liam answered, his hand shaking so badly he almost dropped the phone. "Liam," Eleanor's voice came through the speaker, tinny and clear. "Listen to me. There is no time. Go now. Get your daughter and get the papers. They will be at the basement stairs. Do you hear me? Thugs? Not him. He will send his animals to do the dirty work. You cannot fight them." Her voice was a lifeline of calm in his sea of panic. He felt his mind snapping back into focus, the terror being replaced by a sharp, adrenaline-fueled clarity. He had to move. Right now. His daughter's life depended on it. "But where do I go? They'll be at the only way out," he hissed into the phone, his voice a frantic whisper. "There is another way," Elena's voice insisted, steady and strong. "An old way, from before the war. The secret room you found, the banker's study. At the back near the floor there is a small iron door, a coal chute. It leads to the alley behind the building. It has not been opened in 60 years. You must get through it. Do you understand? A coal chute, a tiny forgotten escape hatch, a sliver of hope so thin it was almost invisible. But it was there. It was a chance." He felt a surge of desperate energy. "Yes," he breathed. "Yes, I understand." He was already moving, stumbling through Elena's dark apartment towards the door. The plan was insane, a mad dash into the unknown, but it was the only plan he had. The image of Maya, alone in the dark, spurred him on. A fire at his heels. His fear was still there, a cold stone in his gut, but it was now overlaid with a fierce primal resolve. He burst out of Elena's apartment and ran, his sock-clad feet silent on the cold hallway floor. He didn't dare take the stairs. He found the service elevator and pried the doors open, sliding down the cables in the pitch-black shaft, his hands burning from the friction, his heart hammering in his throat. He landed with a jolt in the basement. The darkness here a physical, suffocating presence. It was colder, damper, and the silence was absolute. Then he heard it. The sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps descending the main concrete stairwell. Not the light, clicking steps of Finch, but the heavy, thudding boots of large men. They were here. He raced down the hallway to their unit, his hands fumbling for the door. Just as he slipped inside, he heard a tremendous crash from the end of the hall as the main steel door to the stairwell was kicked open. They were in the basement. He had seconds. "Maya!" he whispered frantically into the darkness. "Maya, wake up!" He heard a small, sleepy whimper from the corner. He scrambled towards the sound, his hands sweeping through the blackness until he touched her arm. She cried out, startled and afraid. "Shh, sweetie. It's Daddy. We have to go. We're playing a game." His voice was a strained, desperate lie. He scooped her up into his arms, her small body trembling. At that moment, a thunderous boom shook their own door, making the whole concrete room vibrate. It was the sound of a sledgehammer or a boot, a raw, violent impact that splintered the wood of the doorframe. Maya screamed, a terrified, piercing sound that was immediately swallowed by another deafening crash. The thugs were here. They were breaking down the door. The raw, animalistic terror he felt was unlike anything he had ever known. His daughter was screaming, and monsters were trying to break in and kill them. Liam's phone, still clutched in his hand, was a beacon of light. Eleanor was still on the line, her voice a steady anchor in the storm of chaos and noise. "The toolbox! Liam! You need the diary! You need the proof!" Her words cut through his panic. The toolbox. He couldn't leave it. He couldn't let them win. With Maya clinging to his neck, he lunged for the pile of blankets, grabbing the heavy metal box with his free hand. The main door groaned, a long, tearing sound of wood giving way. Another shattering impact, and he could see a sliver of the dim hallway light through a new crack in the door. They were almost through. "Go!" Elena shouted through the phone. "Into the study, now!" He stumbled backwards, pulling Maya with him, and dove through the opening into the pitch-black, dusty sanctuary of Jacob's study. The air was thick with the smell of splintered wood and the coppery scent of his own fear. He was trapped in a box within a box, the sounds of his hunters growing louder and closer. He aimed the phone's light at the back wall of the study, frantically searching. The beam danced and shook, reflecting off the dust-covered books. Another deafening crash from the outer room. The main door had burst open. He could hear their heavy footsteps, the crunch of plaster under their boots. "Where is he?" A rough voice growled. "Check the back." He found it. A small, square iron door, flush with the wall near the floor, its surface covered in a thick layer of rust. The coal chute. It was held shut by a simple iron latch, but it was rusted solid. He put Maya down behind him. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice shaking. He dropped the toolbox, fumbled it open, and grabbed the pry bar. The heavy steel felt good in his hand, a familiar weight. He jammed the tip of it under the latch, his only tool against a 70-year-old seal. He pulled with all his might, his muscles screaming. The metal groaned but didn't budge. "He's in here!" a voice shouted from the other side of the study wall. He heard them discovering the hidden doorway. He had no time. He braced his foot against the wall and put his entire body into it, a guttural roar of pure desperation tearing from his throat. With a piercing shriek of tortured metal, the latch snapped. The iron chute door swung inward with a cloud of coal dust and a blast of frigid Chaos wet night air. It smelled of freedom. At that exact moment, the flimsy wooden door to the study was kicked open, and the hulking silhouettes of two large men filled the doorway, their forms black against the dim light of the outer room. "There!" one of them yelled. Liam didn't hesitate. He grabbed Maya and pushed her through the small, dark opening of the chute. "Go, go, go!" he yelled. She slid down the short, steep metal slide and landed in the mud of the alley below. He heard a heavy thud as one of the thugs lunged for him. He threw the toolbox out into the alley and scrambled into the chute, head first, just as a hand grabbed at his ankle. He kicked back wildly, his foot connecting with something solid. He heard a grunt of pain, and then he was sliding, tumbling out of the chute and landing hard in a puddle of icy, foul-smelling water in the back alley. The cold shocked his system, but the adrenaline was afire in his veins. He grabbed the toolbox and Maya's hand. "Run!" he screamed. They ran. Their feet slapped against the wet pavement of the dark, narrow alley, the towering brick walls of the building on either side of them. He could hear shouting from the chute behind them, but he didn't look back. He ran with a singular, desperate purpose, dragging his terrified, crying daughter behind him. They burst out of the alley onto the main street. The building's entrance was just 50 feet away. It felt like a mile. He ran towards the light, towards Elena's promise of safety, his lungs burning, his heart about to explode, the 70-year-old secret heavy in his hand. Gasping for air, his lungs burning with an icy fire, Liam stumbled out of the narrow alley and onto the cold, wet pavement of the street. He felt a wave of dizziness, the adrenaline from the chase warring with his profound exhaustion. He pulled Maya close, her small body trembling uncontrollably against his. The toolbox, slick with mud and water, felt impossibly heavy, her physical manifestation of the 70-year-old burden he now carried. The building loomed over them, its entrance a small pool of light in the vast darkness. He could hear shouting from the alley behind them, the guttural yells of the thugs. He didn't look back. With the last of his strength, he ran, his feet splashing through puddles, his only thought to reach the door, to reach Eleanor. He burst into the lobby, a chaotic mess of mud and fear, and saw her waiting at the bottom of the stairs. She held a heavy wool coat, her ancient face a mask of grim determination. Wordlessly, she met his terrified gaze and nodded upwards. Her message was clear in the charged silence. The time for running was over. The time to fight had arrived. The solid click of Elena's bolted door was a balm to Liam's shattered nerves. Inside her small, warm apartment, the world felt sane again. The air, thick with the comforting sense of old books and hot tea, was a world away from the basement stench of rot and terror. As Elena moved with urgent purpose to a battery-powered lamp and her old landline phone, Liam knelt on the worn rug. He wrapped the heavy coat around Maya, murmuring reassurances he didn't feel himself. "We're safe now, sweetie. We're safe." His heart ached as he felt her small body shaking against his. He felt hollowed out, drained. But a cold resolve was beginning to form in the pit of his stomach. He placed the muddy toolbox on the table, opened it, and laid out the diary and the bonds. Under the lamp's soft glow, they looked like sacred relics. He heard Elena's voice on the phone, low and firm, stripped of its accent. "David, it's Elena Petrova. The time has come. The superintendent's ghost is walking again, and I'm looking at the proof." Less than an hour later, a quiet, firm knock on the door made Liam's heart seize in his chest, but Eleanor was calm as she opened it to a man who radiated quiet, unshakable authority. He was tall, dressed in a dark, perfectly tailored suit, his grey-templed hair and intelligent eyes a match for Elena's own weary wisdom. He was David Stern, a senior attorney for the Historical Preservation Society. He entered the room, and the atmosphere shifted, charged now with the gravity of the law. He listened intently as Liam, his voice raw and halting, recounted the entire nightmare from the false hope of the ad to the terror of the chase. David then examined the evidence. He handled the diary with a gentle reverence, his gaze sweeping over the German script. He inspected the bonds, his expression hardening into a mask of cold fury. "The attack on you and your daughter is a state felony," he said, his voice a low, controlled rumble. "But this," he gestured to the diary, "this is a matter of Nazi-era asset recovery. This is a federal crime. This is for the FBI." Eleanor made coffee, the familiar, rich scent, a small anchor of normalcy in the surreal situation. David Stern made a single or brief phone call. "I have a credible witness, physical evidence, and an active threat involving a national historical asset. I need your best team at this address. Now." The authority in his voice was absolute, sending a shiver down Liam's spine. While they waited, David asked Liam to repeat the story of the attack, this time recording it. As Liam spoke, he felt a shift inside him. The act of giving official testimony, of having his terror validated by this powerful, serious man, began to transform his fear into a cold, hard anger. He was no longer just a victim. He was a witness. He was the voice for Jacob Rosenthal, the man who died alone in the dark. He was the voice for the Rosenbaums and the Adlers, The weight on his shoulders had not lessened, but its nature had changed. It was no longer the crushing weight of despair, but the heavy, solid weight of purpose. He would see this through. He would not let Finch win. The arrival of the authorities was not a storm of sirens and flashing lights, but a quiet, deadly tide. Two unmarked black sedans glided to a halt in front of the building, their presence barely disturbing the pre-dawn stillness. Men in dark jackets emblazoned with FBI moved with a silent, coordinated efficiency that was terrifying to behold. David and Eleanor led them into the building, leaving Liam with a uniformed officer to guard Maya, who was now sleeping fitfully in Elena's bed. Liam listened, his heart pounding, to the sounds from the hallway. He heard them take the elevator to the penthouse. He heard a single, sharp command. FBI! Open the door. He heard the sound of a battering ram, a single explosive boom that shattered the silence. He pictured Finch, the monster in the tailored suit, being dragged from his lair. A wave of profound, shuddering relief washed over Liam, so intense it made his knees feel weak. It was over. The monster had been caught. He slid down the wall and sat on the floor, burying his face in his shaking hands. Alistair Finch, clad in silk pajamas, was apprehended without a struggle. His mask of polite civility shattered the moment he saw David Stern standing behind the federal agents. In his eyes, Liam was later told, was not fear, but a flash of pure, unadulterated hatred, the rage of a predator whose rightful meal had been snatched away at the last moment. The two thugs were found in a nearby bar, spending the blood money they'd been paid for the attack. The investigation was swift and brutal. Armed with the diary, Liam's testimony, and decades of co-op board records, the FBI painted a picture of Finch's reign of terror. They discovered a long history of extortion, threats, and suspicious accidents that had allowed him to acquire units from vulnerable tenants for pennies on the dollar. They found evidence that his grandfather, the superintendent, had been on the payroll of the German-American Bund in the 1940s. The story Elena had told, the story of Jakob's murder, was no longer just a suspicion. It was the heart of a federal case. The bearer bonds, authenticated by experts in Zurich, were valued at an astonishing figure in today's currency. It was a fortune beyond Liam's wildest imaginings, but it was not his. Following the meticulous records left in Jakob Rosenthal's diary, David Stern and his organization established the Rosenthal Descendants Foundation. Their sole mission was to embark on the monumental task that Jakob never could, to trace the family trees of the dozens of names in the diary, to find the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of the victims, scattered across the globe by the winds of war and time. It was a slow, painstaking process, a global search for the rightful heirs to a 70-year-old promise. News of the discovery made international headlines, a story of justice resurrected from a dusty, fire-hidden tomb. For the first time, the names of the families Jakob had tried to save were spoken aloud with honor, their stories brought into the light. Jakob's work, interrupted by a cruel death, was finally being finished. 2 months later, Liam sat in David Stern's polished mahogany office, staring at a check. For his honesty, his courage, and his role in recovering the assets and bringing Finch to justice, the newly formed foundation had awarded him a finder's fee. The number written on the check had so many zeros it seemed unreal. It was enough to change not just his life, but the lives of his children and his children's children. He looked at the paper, and his mind flashed back to the rickety kitchen table, to the 12 $100 bills he had smoothed out over and over again, the meager sum that had represented the crushing totality of his failure. He felt his throat tighten, and a single hot tear, a tear not of grief or terror but of overwhelming, profound relief, fell and splattered on the crisp paper. He thought of Maya. He thought of a warm bed, a full pantry, a future free from the cold grip of fear. He looked up at David, unable to speak, and simply nodded, the weight of a lifetime of struggle finally, blessedly, lifting from his shoulders. The sunlight streamed through the large, clean windows of the kitchen, illuminating the cheerful yellow walls and the rich grain of a solid oak table. The air smelled not of damp and decay, but of freshly baked bread and the sweet aroma of roasting chicken. Liam stood at the counter, a simple blue apron tied around his waist, chopping vegetables with a steady, confident hand. Outside, in the small, green backyard, he could hear Maya's laughter, a sound so pure and joyous it was like music. She was playing on a swing set he had built for her himself, his old tools finally being used for creation instead of desperation. They lived in a small, beautiful house on a quiet, tree-lined street, a world away from the concrete tomb. He felt a sense of peace so deep it was almost dreamlike. Every detail, the warmth of the sun on his back, the solid feel of the floor beneath his feet, the sound of his daughter's happiness, was a quiet miracle, a constant, blessed contrast to the darkness they had escaped. He was no longer a victim. He was a father, a builder, a man in his own home. Liam placed a hearty, golden-brown chicken on the table next to a bowl of steaming potatoes. He called Maya in for dinner, and she ran into his arms, her cheeks flushed, her eyes sparkling with the simple joy of being a child. As he held her, he felt a gratitude so immense it was a physical presence, a warmth that filled every corner of his being. Their story, born of desperation, had ended in redemption, not just for them, but for the ghosts of a history they had accidentally unearthed. So many stories like theirs lie hidden just beneath the surface of our world, waiting for a crack in the wall, waiting for someone to be brave enough to look inside. The world is full of secrets, of injustices waiting to be righted, and of ordinary people who find extraordinary courage when they are needed most. If you believe that every story deserves to be told, and that the fight for justice is always worth it, then subscribe to our channel and join us in uncovering the light that waits in the darkest of places.